Hello everyone, thanks for joining us for our third 6x6 virtual social gathering. Hope everyone is keeping safe. For those that are new to 6x6, we are a photographic collective of 6 photographers, myself, Stephen McCoy, Adam Lee, Tig Devlin, Colin McPherson, Stephanie Wynne and Craig Easton. Our aim was to curate exhibitions in a cafe bar in Liverpool called Ropes and Twines, and each exhibition was to last about 6 weeks, hence the name 6x6. We had several exhibitions before the lockdown began. We also wanted to encourage conversations and debate and to ask photographers to present their work. Hopefully these real exhibitions will resume before too long. In the meantime, we're continuing to show work on this virtual platform. And this evening, we're delighted to have Michelle Sank with us to talk about her background, influences, and to show us work from several other projects. She'll talk for about 40 minutes, after which we'll open up to questions from participants and our audience. After this, Colin will round things up with a couple of announcements. So just a brief introduction, because Michelle will tell us more about her background and influences. Michelle is a multi-award-winning photographer who was born in Cape Town, South Africa, and she left in 1978 and has been a resident in Britain since 1987. She has been widely exhibited, has worked in many prestigious collections, and has had several books published. She also teaches now on the online MA course at Falmouth University. I first became aware of her work in 2007, I think it was, when she had an exhibition at the Open Eye Gallery, when this gallery was in Wood Street. And this exhibition was entitled The Water's Edge, and there was also a book of the same name. And I think she will talk briefly about this work, as well as her involvement with the 16 touring exhibition, which some of you may have seen at Ropes and Twines and other venues around the UK. So I guess it's over to Michelle now, and I'll probably interrupt annoyingly with a variety of questions as we go along. So Michelle, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Hi everyone. What I'd like to share with you today is my background, the origins and influences of my work, and how I have developed this over the years, both through my own photographic practice, but also through the wider arena of residencies and commissions. As Steve said, I was born and brought up in South Africa, and I lived there into my early adult life. It's also where my interest in photography began. I was doing a fine art degree at the university in Cape Town and doing painting and sculpture. And in the last year of my degree, they introduced a photographic module. And I had no interest or real knowledge of photography at all, but I decided to take it up. And once I got my camera and started shooting, I found this absolute passion that I had not found with the other media I'd been involved with. And it became a real voice for personal expression and almost like an umbilical cord for my connection to the world. I feel it's relevant to just talk a little bit about South Africa for its importance in having shaped my photographic eye, both in the subject matter, but also the photographic elements that I use. South Africa, as I'm sure most of you are aware, is a country that is rich in diversity, both in relation to its multiculturalism and the sense of the exotic that comes from that, but also very rich in relation to its intense dramatic light, strong color, and vast physical spaces. As well as this, it was, when I was growing up, and still is, a country that is replete with human conflict and suffering. I myself am the daughter of Jewish Russian immigrants, so I grew up in a very isolated community. Anti-Semitism was quite prevalent there. So I was exposed daily to the marginalization of this community, but also to what was happening during the apartheid era on a daily basis and the kind of injustices And I really believe that that has sparked my interest in documenting the human condition, social groups, subcultures, people living on the edge of society. The images that are on the screen now are some of the very first images I took as a student in South Africa. And they were, in fact, of a Russian Jewish immigrant community that frequented the seafront in Cape Town. And it was really the beginning for me of the use of light and dark to create some kind of psychological tension in the images. And also, really naively at that stage, but my interest in close contact portraiture and how the portrait and the background set up some kind of narrative. You know, if you look at the image on the left here of the woman and, you know, her jewelry, the way the light is highlighting those peculiarities, and something quite traditional in her dress and something quite masked. And then you've got what was the modernity of the background behind. So the subtle kind of tension in the images. It has been said of my work, certainly my later work, that it's almost as if the portrait has been sort of stuck onto the background. And I guess this also is symbolic of a close contact portraiture, which has become a hallmark of my current photographic practice.
So Michelle, do you think obviously you mentioned studying sort of sculpture, do you think there's an element of that that transfers over to your photographs, that kind of interest in form and shape?
I'm sure there is. Yeah, I think that because we did a lot of life modeling actually, which I was useless at, but you know, so I think that
and it's kind of useful, that isn't it, like, you know, life drawing, you know, looking at the figure for a long time, that can obviously help when it comes to considering, you know, the photographs. You know, you look more intently, don't you, I guess?
Yeah, and the figure in space and the stance, you know, I think stance and body language has become, well, you'll see in the later images, very important to me.
Yeah.
I just have to say at this point that I was very, very privileged to meet David Goldblatt, which I'm sure you're all aware of, as a student in South Africa. He used to frequent the photographic studio, and he came upon my student work and was really extremely encouraging for me. And he became a mentor of mine right the way through the years where I couldn't work, which I'll talk a bit about, and continually through my career. And I really believe that if it wasn't for David's encouragement, I probably would not be in the position I'm in today. And I think if I just show you these examples of just talking about David. So I left South Africa. South Africa, came to England, couldn't stay here, and ended up for various reasons going to Greece. And I tried to do my photographic practice in Greece, but it was really a moment of survival for me. But David had said to me when I left South Africa, he said, and it was a real gift for me. He said, "You have to promise me that you'll never ever stop taking photographs." And that was my parting gift from him, and something that I kept in my mind all the years, which was over 20 years, till I got back to my photography. I came to England.
Did you ever meet him again, Michelle? Did you ever meet David?
Yeah. No, I did quite often. And and I used to send him images up till sort of quite recently, till the last couple of years. So what happened is that I then came to England in 1987 on a work permit, eventually got my residency here, became British, and there was a 20-year gap between that work that you've just seen and the work that's now on the screen. I had in between all these years become a restorer. And I remember just sort of waking up one day and thinking, you know, I was more settled in my life, and just thinking that I would never connect with a broken piece of ceramic, and I had to go back to my photography. And I happened to meet Jem Southam, who lives in Exeter, and Jem told me about these workshops that were happening in Taunton in a place called Duck's Pool, run by Peter Goldfield, yeah. And he had these residential weekend workshops, and I went on a couple of those, and one of them was with Paul Womble, who was then the director of the Photographers Gallery in London. And he was talking about doing master's degrees. And I thought, I can do this. I can work part-time and I can do a part-time MA. So I went up to Leicester and studied with Paul Hill. And one of the things we had to do was, he said to us, I want you to do something you've never done before. And up till then, I had no knowledge of colour photography. It didn't exist for me in South Africa. And I'd been so out of touch with photography up to that point. So I thought, I'm going to work in colour and I'm going to get a medium format camera. So I bought a second-hand Bronica, and out I went, thinking, I only see the world in black and white. And what I did was used to go to places that had resonance for me. So I work very intuitively, and I generally go to places and let imagery come to me. So I started to frequent the seafront because that's where I was brought up in South Africa, and also areas, sort of housing areas that for me had some kind of edge to them. And I was also trying to do landscapes at that stage and trying not to photograph people under the remit that was given to us, but into the contact sheets were creeping images like this. So Paul had a meeting with the other tutor, and in discussion we decided that I would go ahead and carry on photographing. And I became really entranced by these young people. I think they represented something that I longed for from South Africa, that sense of colour, that freedom of individuality, a sense of the exotic.
Yeah.
And it was a real appreciation of beauty for me, about themselves, but also how light and colour were now working for me, and how the two worked together. And this is someone I actually, I was still quite shy at that stage, but I was on the seafront and I saw this wonderful vision on the beach, and I carried on walking, and I thought, you'll never forgive yourself if you don't go back. So I walked back along the sand, and I said to her mother, could I photograph her? And it was just this, she was such a wonderful vision for me, someone who could have had issues around her body image possibly, but there was a real celebration about her, and a real confidence. And then what I was saying about what goes on in the background, that narrative, that almost fantasy world going on in the background that kind of fits with when one is an adolescent and one has all these dreams. And I'll just go through what also became really interesting for me with this work was I became really interested in this in-between stage and this visual disparity between child and adulthood, and the way stance was taken on to resemble adulthood. But for me, there was a degree of vulnerability with this. So for example, in this image, he felt so fragile. He must have been, I think, 12 years old, with the cigarette, this really sort of almost like a porcelain doll. And then this kind of the masculine symbols of the graffiti and the lock and so on. So the subtle kind of play between portrait and background. And then another young girl that I think speaks for herself that I took at a bus stop. Someone else I ran after. I was staying actually at Sean Bonnell's house in Weymouth, and there was this festival, and I went through these crowds, and he was just this wonderful vision, and I carried on, and I thought, no, run back. And I ran back and got him, and for me, that real almost like masculine thing, not having a top and the tattoos, but this beautiful gentleness in his face, and that lovely sensual light that really embraced him with a sense of gentleness.
I mean, looking at these early photographs, Michelle, and your kind of later work,
yeah,
it seems to me that you did establish very early on a working method that has changed very subtly, but it's still that kind of the figure, the background,
yeah,
colour, And it's as though you really have developed very early on, or I'd say early on, you know, as a photographer early on, a working method that you felt you could really deal with, and you know, helped you to kind of like develop the relationships between the background, the figure, the color relationship, the composition.
Yeah. I mean, I think at this stage, I was probably very subconsciously, I was seeing it, but I wasn't that conscious.
Yeah.
And I think so. I'd get these contact sheets and think, gosh, you know, I really must have seen that. And now it's become much more conscious for me. And one thing that David did say to me at one stage, he said, for God's sake, look at the edges of your frame. Because I used to get so excited at seeing the portrait that I didn't really look around the edges.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And she, once again, I mean, this was extraordinary, me finding this young girl with the plaits and this gold coat, and then the intensity of that red. And this project merged into a project called The Emerging Self and Bye Bye Baby. And I also, you know, we're talking about the early, like, 90s, 2000, 2005. Before it was very much in the media, but I sort of was quite taken by this pre-adultization of young children at that stage through, I guess, what was starting through the media, which was evident in their dress, their pose, which we'll probably see in, not so much in this image, but, you know, these images. These girls were 15 and going, I was in a holiday camp at that stage, and they were going out for the night. And once again, you know, this crossover between sort of child and adult, really.
Obviously, I mean, life is obviously full of transitions for all of us, isn't it? From, you know, all different aspects. But
yeah.
These photographs are obviously very much to do with that transition from kind of puberty to adulthood, aren't they? That kind of threshold, as it were.
Absolutely. And you know, on top of dealing with, I guess, the psychological element for me, I think for me as well, when I look at something like this, they're like gems for me. You know, the wonderment of the dress, the jewelry, the shoes, you know, it's a celebration for me in some way. And I do think, you know, this work is partly autobiographical for me as well, about my own adolescence and, you know, which was not always an easy pathway. And so quite self-reflective as well. Yeah.
So you've talked about David Goldblatt as being obviously a very, very big influence. Any other photographers that you felt as though you could, you know, relate to and influenced you in the way that you worked?
I think Philip de Corsia was someone I was really drawn towards because of the sense of poetry in his work. You know, there was a real lyricism to his work and the way he used light and performance, in a sense. And of course, people like Alex Soth now, you know, as for a lot of people, and people like Augusta Sander, you know, those wonderful portraits.
Good. So I guess we better move along.
Okay. So I mean, after you know, that work I went on for quite a while, and then I did a lot of self-initiated projects about young parents, adolescent boys who had been in prison. And then I was offered my first commission with Photo Gallery in Cardiff. And this was to do with young carers. And what was interesting is that, you know, I continued to use this waste finder. So I was almost at a child level. And what I started to do with this work was to photograph them doing their jobs at home, which were almost quite Victorian in a sense, and then asking them, so it was very collaborative, this project, asking them to dress up in something that they wanted to wear and to take me to a place that was important for them. And in discussions with Chris Kopok, this work went forward. But one of the reasons for showing this work as well is that I was given, this was all done in Wales, I was given a place, I had no sat-nav, and it was always in the middle of the day. And for some reason, for the month I was there, I had this intense sunlight. So I started using fill and flash, which became really interesting for me because it simulated that wonderful central light in South Africa. And this is now something that I use almost exclusively in my current practice.
Yeah.
So these are just some examples from the Young Carers Project. And this was a really wonderful project for them. You know, it was also before the Young Carers was very much in the media, and it was the first time that someone had actually come and spent time with them and made them feel special in a way. And there was an exhibition for them at Photo Gallery, and so it was a very rewarding project. Yeah. And then I'm just going to show you one of my other commissions with young people. I then got sort of commissioned quite a lot from galleries and other organizations, including Belfast Exposed Gallery for me. And this was extraordinary because I'd always had a pull towards Belfast because of the similarity politically with South Africa. And I was asked to come there and make a series of portraits of young people from across the political divide, so that you wouldn't know who was Protestant and who was Catholic. And I remember being told that I could do this work because I had a funny accent that didn't fit into either camp. But what I did with this was to change my format, actually, and to use a square format, which gave me a real sense of classicism, actually, and brought the full body into the portrait. And what sort of became quite relevant for me, you know, the sense of religion all over Belfast, and then taking this young girl in the state of repose next to this church with that medallion. So it you know, there were little symbols coming through, these twins, you know, that wonderful light and flatness you get there. And you know, I was introduced to some young people through youth groups, but I was also asked to do street work. So there was a huge group of goths that used to meet in the center. And then, you know, this guy, I think, was a stripper in one of the clubs there. But a different sense of bringing the full body in. And then the book Becoming has images from all the bodies of work that I did around young people, and was
I think you mentioned that as well as Becoming. Was that your first publication?
That was my first publication. Yeah.
That was really kind of like established you. Do you think or gave you sort of validity as a photographer?
I guess so. I guess so. Yeah. Yes, it was an important sort of mark for me, really.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, you've mentioned obviously already sort of collaboration. I'm going to perhaps raise an issue that is quite difficult to talk about in very limited time, but the idea of kind of, whenever you photograph people, the idea of exploitation of people.
Yeah.
Photographing them and kind of not you know, there are kind of lots of different levels of exploitation. Let's be aware of that. You know, you can be very, very sensitive. You can be sort of a user of people. And I'm just wondering how you kind of dealt with that kind of issue, or whether you've ever been accused of exploiting people for your own ends, or, you know, how you deal with that issue, really.
Yeah, I haven't had that. I think what has been said is the gentleness or the empathy that is, and I think what's happened to me with all the portraiture that I've done is that I don't see myself as being separate. It's very much a relationship, and I've always said that the stories that I've had with these people, whether it's 5 minutes or 20 minutes, have been invaluable for me. And you know, I have so many wonderful memories of working with these people that I hope that there is a sense of empathy there. But yeah, so I've always been very humbled, grateful that people allow me to work with them, actually. You know, and it becomes much more than that. It becomes like this work that I've been doing over lockdown. You know, people are now inviting me back for parties, and, you know, it's becoming much more, so wherever that will be.
It can develop into something that you don't really want to develop into as well.
Well, I think one can control that, but, you know, often I've come out of shoots, like especially with some of the work in Liverpool, and just think, you know, this has been extraordinary that I have been allowed to hear these stories or be exposed to this. And You know, I
Have you
see.
ever had any? Have you had any feedback from these people that you photographed, perhaps, in becoming, the
Yes.
kind of feedback that you've been given from them?
Yeah, so for example, if I think of the exhibition with Teenagers Belfast, it originally, the gallery set it up as like a real gallery opening, but invited all the kids there. And the kids just walked in and the whole thing just dissolved into this wonderful communal. So everything about gallery and speeches just went out the window. And I think also with the young carers, it was really important for them to have images, to see themselves on the wall and be acknowledged in some way. So that's certainly and the same with 16, I think that's.
Shall we move along as swiftly as we can?
Yeah. So I know Steve wanted me to talk about this. What happened was that I then had other commissions, and then Patrick Henry, who was the director of Photo Gallery, had seen my work for Belfast Exposed and so on, and asked me if I would be interested in doing some work with women who used to work on the waterfront in conjunction with an oral archivist, Dr. Joanne Lacey. And he said, but they're not young people. And I said, no, that's absolutely fine. And it kind of linked back almost to the older people I was working with in South Africa. And I mean, this is Blaise on the cover. She's the one young person. And I think I mentioned to you, Steve, it was the most extraordinary. I ended up, she was a stripper in a pub at the end of Dock Road, and that experience, it was just extraordinary. Anyway, so she's on the cover of the book. But what was interesting for me with these women is their stories had never been told. So once again, I was given a bit of their background from Joanne, and then I was also given a time and a place, and I realized that they were very old and that I had to be very prepared. So I'd go in advance and look at space in which I could possibly place them. But just, she was a very religious woman, and I asked her to change when I got there because I didn't feel what she was wearing was right. And she came out in this beautiful blue outfit and then stood, in this almost religious pose with these trees that are almost like cypress trees. And it was just like God-given, really. And this is the woman who worked in the pub, at that pub where Blaise, and just for me that her face just shows such harshness of life, really. And then this very delicate blouse that she's wearing, just that subtle contrast and this beautiful light. And then once again, there was real pathos for me. This woman had lost both her children to a genetic disease and her husband. And she used to be a painter on the ships. And she told me she still had her dungarees up in the attic. And as we were walking back, she just put her hand on her heart and just looked up. And for me, her whole story became represented in that kind of gesture. And of course, that beautiful light and the clouds, really. And then Carol was a character. Carol was the only female controller at the dock at that stage. And it was interesting when I photographed her, I realized afterwards she was almost like one of those ship's figureheads. She was incredibly powerful. And I just realized that you couldn't mess with Carol. She was incredibly... and then that was in the exhibition. So this was a little stall on Dock Road.
Yes, know it well. Still there.
Yeah.
The kiosk there, but Stanley.
Yeah. And then this was also wonderful. She lived in supported housing. And I went there and I said, Kitty, what do you love doing? She said, I love dancing. So I said, well, could you get into a dancing dress and then we'll go outside? And it was just these flowers. It was just wonderful. So that's that work. And then I had...
I have to whiz through this quite quickly.
Yeah. Okay. So what happened is that I had a lot of commissions both here and abroad, and I felt in a way I was becoming a bit like a performing monkey, and that I was just sort of pushing out not pushing out, but doing a lot of the young people. So I had a year's residency in the Channel Islands, which was extraordinary. And that took me back to really how I used to work in South Africa, where I could just go into the streets on a daily basis and shoot whatever I wanted and build up a narrative. And my remit for this was really to make a contemporary archive of what was going on the island. There was no contemporary archive. There was a historical archive, but no contemporary archive. So this, for example, is a president of one of the major banks, very, very difficult to get access to, but wonderful experience. And then this is a housing estate, which they try and not show, because everything is so ordered and perfect in that environment. And I was encouraged to show this aspect. So this was after a children's party, a great sense of religion and ritual and control that I found within the community there. These pageants that happen. So she was Miss St. Helier, one of the parishes. So a real shift in my portraiture and images like this, which really represented the sort of royalty of it all. Once again, and this almost thread of red that went through the project, the real orderliness of the island. You know, there's some really interesting stories that I won't get into, and there's a lot more work around this. This is a very old Art Deco swimming pool, a police shooting range. So this woman who lives in this
Stephanie and I went to Guernsey a couple of years ago. It's a very odd place, isn't it? It's sort of more British than British in a way, but yet I made the mistake of saying, well, it's part of Britain, but they say no, it isn't. It's a dependency. So it's a very odd place.
Yeah, and this, for example, when I first got this, it's forgotten the name, but you don't see a human being in the street. And I thought, I have to get in and just see what goes on in those houses. So I met her and in I went. So this was beautiful for me. This old couple who still speak Patois, the old Guernsey language, in this old Guernsey house. Could never have children, but absolutely devoted to one another. And then just some things like landscape and so on. And then, other things happened after that, but then I was very, very grateful that Craig asked me to be part of 16. And this was wonderful. I was living in Cornwall, obviously teaching there, and was asked if I could cover those areas of Cornwall, which are considered to be some of the poorest in the UK. And for me, this was remarkable because it didn't turn out to be what I expected, that in the interviews, there was great positivity about living in this area and not wanting to leave this area, and the importance of family and community. So the interviews went with the work. What's also really interesting for me, and a shift in my work, is my standing back and having more distance now and allowing things, not controlling the background so much. And that's been a real change. Images like this, which I guess links back to that very first image.
Yeah, the difference. It's obviously you've always been interested in background.
Yeah.
Sort of location, whether it's exterior or interior.
Yeah.
Where the actual background, the location now is starting to dominate the person a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah, and then just a freer way of working, really.
Yeah.
And then this is the project I've been working on now for the last 7 weeks. I'll just show a couple of images from this, but I've just been going out virtually every day, or certainly at the beginning, to a neighborhood near where I live for my daily walk. And it's been an absolute wonderful thing for me. It's the only real people I've really seen and engaged with. But these are some of so this is also becoming now quite a large body of work on people that I've met and things that are becoming metaphors for the situation.
Right now, metaphor. I want to talk to you about metaphor very briefly, because you mentioned it before in your photographs as well. And it's kind of like something that I try to avoid at all cost, is the idea of metaphor. For me, the kind of, the photograph or the subject should be what the subject is. So the idea of metaphor, could you maybe just expand on that?
This image for me is a metaphor for what's going on now, or what has been going on. The sense of this cracked wall, the light, the way it's sort of cracking that wall, and the dismantling of that. So that's probably a good example of that. And then obviously, you know, the other work that I haven't shown, the work of myself, where I was photographing people in their bedrooms, everything around there became a metaphor for who they were or their personalities, you know, little tiny little.
So how do you go about juggling all these different things, Michelle? Because obviously you kind of, you have commissions, you have personal work, you teach. How I guess in common with a lot of photographers, very similar position, you're having to juggle all these different things. Do you find that they are mutually beneficial, or do you kind of keep things separate at all cost?
You know, it's been very difficult actually, and it's taken a lot of will on my part. And in fact, you know, those commissions were very good for me towards the end, but they were also short-lived. And that's why I felt that my work wasn't developing the way I wanted to develop, in a sense, which is what happened with Ensu. And I was lucky to get time off work for that. But that's one of the reasons why I gave up my job in Falmouth, actually, because I felt that if I didn't do it now, yeah, so that's one of the reasons. And certainly the In My Skin project, which I also haven't shown here, I got to a point, I think I was running a year at the university. I was responsible for the second year, and I just felt I had no time, and I thought the only way I was going to make work was to give myself a project where I made contact with people and had to physically then travel. So on weekends I would just travel over the UK photographing, and that, you know, so that was really quite a conscious decision for me. But now it's, you know, this, I feel like, you know, with all the awfulness of what's going on, I feel like I've been on a residency for the last 7 weeks. So, you know, and it's something that I'm now going to continue with.
Brilliant.
So
is that your last slide, by the way?
This one was the last one.
Excellent. Well, all I can say, Michelle, is that's absolutely brilliant. I appreciate that so much for showing that work. And I realise it's been a bit of a rush, but if anybody wants to see more Michelle's work, just search Michelle Sank online, and you can see all the projects that she's been working on over the years. Some fantastic work. So thanks, Michelle. And obviously, if anybody who's got any other questions, I think Craig is going to just organise those now.
Yes. Well, Michelle, thank you. And Steve, that was great. It was really, really interesting. Obviously, I know your work, Michelle, but it's lovely to hear you talk about it. So thanks for that. We have got some questions, if I may. I'm just going to have to unmute people so I can bring them in. David Edwards has a question for you, if I may. Can I introduce David? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Really interesting you talking about running after people and collaring them to take photographs of them. Something I've done, and I just wonder, have you had any, do the positives outweigh the negative returns? Or do you have all positives when you run up to someone and go, can I take a photograph?
Can I tell you, mostly it's positive. I think, look, obviously, you know, when I was doing this project, I wanted to photograph the sky, and he said, I don't want to be photographed. I said, that's fine. But really, I'd say 99% of the time, and I guess I'm quite eccentric. And I think that maybe, you know, comes across. And I think I get so excited when I see something that maybe comes through, you know, like Craig and I were talking with the 16 work. Initially, I was walking into people's gardens and saying, do you have any 16-year-olds who live here?
I couldn't get away with that.
And the thing is that, I mean, I've also got to be in the right frame of mind. You know, it's interesting because, you know, in Greece, I had to sell advertising to survive. And I was, as I said, I was actually very shy. But I think that, and I could only sell advertising if I was in a good frame of mind. And I think it's a similar thing. You know, I can't approach people if I'm feeling a bit, So, but that is for me all part of the relationship. Do you know what I mean?
And a final question. Have you gone back to the people that you photographed and met them years later, like on the cover of Becoming? have you had any?
No, but I had a really wonderful thing happen to me about 10 days ago. I photographed this guy, Dave, probably about 12 or 15 years ago. And I was walking on my daily walk, you know, where I'm photographing, and suddenly he appeared and I went up and I said, hello. I said, do you remember me? Because my hair was different. And he did. And we had this wonderful interlude. And, you know, so I've actually, for this project I've been doing is making sure that everyone gets an image now. So I managed to find the image of him with his dog, who's since died. And anyway, so that's, yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed, because it's been a fantastic evening. Thank you.
Okay.
I've got Ty Devlin is going to speak to us. Ty, let me just bring you in. Can you hear us?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for that. That was really interesting. It's always interesting hearing about other people's work and the different sort of projects and how it changes. But wanted to ask, and I suppose it would vary quite a lot on the different projects that you've worked on, but wanted to ask about, you know, how much time you spend with the individual. So rather than, I suppose, the question that David asked about, if it was someone you see in the street, but more the ones that were organized, like the young carers,
Yeah.
and if you speak to them beforehand, and then if that changes the picture, the sort of, you know, the discussions and conversations you have.
If you take the young carers, I hadn't met them before, and you know, I was just given a name and an address. So, but once I was in that environment, I would talk to them, and they would talk to me about the situation and what it was like for them to be a young carer. So, in those situations, I can spend a lot of time. Sometimes
Yeah.
it can, you know, I have one image of a girl in pink that maybe you've seen on my website. I only have one image of her. She just crossed my path, and I asked her, and that was that. So, but for the most part, I will talk to people. Yeah. So.
And so does it sometimes take quite a long period of time, or sometimes
No, because
not so long?
I'll often talk when I'm shooting as well. So it's not as if I see someone and then stop and talk a lot. I'll see someone, ask if I can work with them, and then start working with them, and then talk to them while I'm photographing, but also afterwards. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
All right, thanks.
For the more formal things, like in my skin, you know, I was going all over the UK to places I didn't even know, and so sometimes when I'd go in, that was perhaps more of a time to just get to know someone, and then to ask how best to work together.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks.
Okay.
Cool. Michelle, can I be cheeky and ask you a question myself?
Yes.
Because you know that I love your work, and you know that I'm a real admirer of the way you manage to get such emotion out of people, and the way you do approach people in the street. And I've heard people say that it's easier for you because you're a woman.
Yeah.
I think it's actually the opposite. I think it's much, much, much scarier as a woman to walk into a housing estate where you don't know anybody and ask people. I remember I read Alex Soth talking about this, where he was scared to death photographing some neo-Nazi in the middle of the desert.
Yes.
How do you cope with that? I mean, you know, because you are a woman on your own with expensive cameras around your shoulders, and you seem to break down barriers more than anybody else I know.
You know, it's what can I say? The only time I've got scared was actually with those twins in Belfast, because they said to me, I said, you know, could we get out of this housing area? And they said, well, you know, I'll take you to this estate. And we were suddenly in this empty ground, and there were all these guys sort of drinking and sort of broken bottles. And I thought, oh my God, you know, we were in this like wasteland, really. And then I thought, well, you know, and I said to this like 12-year-old, I said, are we okay here? And he said, yeah, we're fine, we know them. So I think that's the only time I've really been scared. And interesting enough, what's happened now is maybe I'm too trusting, I don't know. But the other day I sort of had my bag on the ground, and someone I was photographing said, don't do this. You mustn't do that, because, you know, if you go further down the road, someone will just take it from you. so I don't feel scared. It's interesting. I don't know if my camera empowers me in some way. And maybe coming from South Africa, you know, where one was surrounded with such violence and such imminent danger all the time, that maybe what I experience here feels much less frightening for me, maybe naively. But yeah, I don't know if...
Yeah, I think maybe you disarm them with your South African charm. Is that what's going on?
And then I said, what's the worst that can happen? They take my camera. Well, you know.
I'm sure it's not £20 that you give them, Michelle.
No, and you know, it's interesting because I also wonder, and someone has said this, but maybe they feel that and I do see myself on their level in a way. I don't see myself as being someone different, and maybe they pick that up. But yeah, that it's a fair playing field, you know.
Cool. Right. Well, I because everybody's muted, it's not easy for them to ask questions unless they type something into the group chat. If anybody wants to type something in, then I'll come to them and they can ask a question. But if not, we'll sort of wrap it up quite soon. I just want to mention one other thing. Because you were part of this whole 16 project right from the start, weren't you? And many of us shot pictures right at the beginning, before we had any funding. Yes. And the funding came through, and you did very different work.
Yeah.
The first ones you sent me have never seen the light of day, other than between you and me, I think.
I know, and I was kind of looking at them the other day, because there's one of a girl with her phone, B. She's looking at herself in her phone, putting her makeup on, I think it was. Yeah. No, that's interesting. And that I worked in a very, very, you know, I worked in quite a sort of affluent area. So that was quite interesting. And I think I started that in winter, so I was working indoors. Right. I think so, yeah.
Nicola Morley wants to ask you a question. Let me just see if I can. Nicola, can you hear us?
Yes. Yes, Michelle, that was so wonderful. Hi, Michelle.
Hi.
It's really, really great. Are you still shooting on film, or have you turned to digital?
You know, I'm digital now. When I did the residency in the Channel Islands in 2013, there was no lab there. So, and I had to turn my images, you know, had to turn them around quite quickly. So I crossed over to digital there. But it's interesting now that I have more time, you know, now that I'm not teaching at film, I've been going through all my own cameras and just thinking about film again. And my fridge still has film in it. So, because I do think there's a different, you know, slightly different nuance.
Well, it's the process as well, isn't it? It's
yeah.
Slower, yeah.
Yeah.
But the way you process your digital files has a sort of filmic look to it, doesn't it?
Yeah. And yes, I'm not quite sure how, but yeah.
I'm gonna bring someone else in. Sorry, okay. Nicola, I'm going to mute you. Is that all right?
Nice to see
you. Steve Smith wants to say something. Steve.
Go on. Yeah, that was actually me. Actually, what I wanted to ask you, Michelle, was, you know, very interesting initial shot with for 16. I did actually wonder whether it was being a bit satirical, whether it was being very rude about the 16-year-old in question, who looked very diffident and very shy. You can imagine, you know, kids say things like, "Oh my God, state of me," you know, many years down the line. But actually, from what you've talked about, your images of teenagers and, you know, and younger children growing up, they're incredibly sympathetic. They're absolutely brilliant. But can I ask you to talk me through that first shot?
Is that the one of the girl in the red dress?
Yes.
Okay, well, that was really interesting because I photographed her initially at a youth center, you know, and I photographed her in a t-shirt, and I just felt I didn't get her, and I asked her if she would mind if I rephotographed her. So she came with her mother, and they bought this bag of clothes with them, and that was her prom outfit. Wow. So she wanted to wear that, so that's how that came about.
Wow.
I know, it was extraordinary actually.
When I saw that first image, I didn't know whether it was a kind of, the whole thing was about, prom girls looking dreadful because they're too fat kind of thing. But, thank you for,
Yeah, no, yeah.
It was her choice. No, extraordinary. Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'm just going to introduce Colin. Colin's going to say a few words and we're just going to wrap it up. But firstly, can I say thank you both to Steve and to Michelle and everyone else. Colin, are you there?
Thanks very much, Michelle and Steve. That was really great. Really enjoyed that. A couple of things just before we close. A little bit about 6x6. I'll be very brief about this. We were formed last year. There's 6 of us and we're all volunteers. What we've done over the last 9 months is being able to put together these amazing shows at Ropes and Twines in Liverpool, which is a great little gallery space, and we've had a lot of support from the owner, Gin, and also the staff there. Obviously, being in lockdown at the moment, things are, if you like, in abeyance, but we're very much hoping to get back to Ropes and Twines before too long and start putting physical shows and talks on. One of the things that we're really big on, I suppose, in 6x6 is managing to do things really well. So the shows that we've had, Graham Oxby's show, for instance, and Amanda Jackson, they've looked great, but also they've really benefited from the fact that both artists have come to Liverpool and talked about their work. And we've had really great evenings listening to them speaking. These things don't come for free, although these things that we've been watching online do. And we were wondering, as a collective, whether you, our supportive community out there, would be mindful of the fact that we are in a sort of difficult situation. When we get back to Ropes and Twines, we really want to carry on putting these wonderful shows on. Funding is always a problem. We are unfunded and we are, as I said, volunteers. What we'll be maybe asking you to do, very nicely, very quietly, is possibly just make a small contribution to our resilience fund, which was, I suppose, going to be set up so that we can put shows on in the future. We were just about to show Stuart Friedman's The Palaces of Memory when COVID-19 struck and we all got locked down. We're envisaging when we come back that we will have to somehow get the resources together to put shows on. I think Craig's going to put up a little PayPal address on the screen now. And we're just wondering if you've enjoyed what we're doing so far at Ropes and Twines, and if you've enjoyed what we've been doing online as well, whether you might consider just dropping a couple of quid into our PayPal account. And what we'd like to do over the next few months is build up a little resilience fund so we can continue the work. We hope that's not too much to ask, and we hope you've enjoyed what we've done so far. We're really excited about the future, and we want to take you as a community, and it's now a worldwide community that we've got with 6x6. We want to take you along on that journey. So thank you in advance for anything you can help us with. And finally, I would just like to say that the next online social that we'll be having is in 2 weeks' time, on the 21st of May, when our very own Stephanie Wynn and Stephen McCoy will be presenting their absolutely incredible and wonderful project Triangulation, not to be missed. They'll be talking about that and showing some of that spectacular work online. Thanks, guys. Keep safe, stay at home while we still have to, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time.